presentation is put your own ribbon on Smart View. A little bit about the get up here. K-scopes prior. Some of my coworkers were. Sure. Wonderful. A few of my coworkers were actually kind of, I don't like to use the H word, but mildly harassing me. They gave me the nickname of Dr. Smart View, and they were kind of tweeting along, and that was the picture that happened to come with it, with a nice little meme on it. I didn't really think I could really fully pull off the minion guy, the mad scientist. I'll shave the head. Eventually I will be bald, so that may come someday. I actually picked DJ Romeo because I got two little girls. They watch a lot of Disney and cartoons and stuff, and I thought that was probably a better look because I could at least send a picture to them. The other guy probably wouldn't do so well for them. But I'm Gary Adashek. I'm a senior EPM architect for GE. Telling you a little bit about GE. So GE is a global industrial company now these days. A number of different, what we call business units throughout GE. On their own, typically each one of those business units are multi-billion-dollar companies. So power, oil and gas, energy, aviation, healthcare, transportation, down the line. So this was from a slide on the annual report in 2014. Some of the things for GE have changed since then. Okay? So other vendors here at Kscope like to give their pitch of their company, why you should go with them, how many consulting dollars they make every year, how many books they publish, all that wonderful stuff. That's great. But I also want to tell you about the company that I work for, which is GE, and why I want you to come work for GE someday. Being serious. We're recognized as one of the world's leading companies for a number of different reasons. And you can see some of those different awards and accolades that GE has achieved over time. Other direction. So along with the 100-year legacy of GE and the branding, one of the taglines that I think many people recognize and kind of where the presentation kind of came from for me was that we bring good things to life. So I think people have heard that. Whether you were born before or after 1979, many people have heard that tagline. So for this presentation, what I'm going to kind of go through is the customized solution that I had worked on and developed as a utility for Smart View. We're going to go through and talk about some of the tools that are required for the job to be able to do that. Walk you through step by step of how to create it and what's involved in that process. We're also going to talk about some of the code that drives Smart View as well. And then that would lead to you having the ability to create your own custom Smart View ribbon. So I know there were other sessions prior to this one during the week where other people were building ribbons of their own. So someone else had built one for HFM, more specifically for their client, their customer, their company that they work for. Okay? The other thing to recognize is that you should, whenever you're building, developing, customizing something, test it, and then retest it, and then retest it again to make sure that it works the way you want it and the way that you intend it to work. Okay, we'll go over some of those things throughout the presentation. The other thing we're going to talk about is saving it so that it can be enabled as an add-in, so you don't have to have users open a file and find it and figure out where that's at. It just natively appears as any other add-in that you'd enable. So the brainchild of this for me was when I started working for GE Healthcare a number of years ago. And when I started working for healthcare, I was excited as a new GE employee. I was going to come to a company that was using the latest and greatest technology. In the year 2010, we were using Office 2000 and 2003. So I was just a little bit sad and disappointed. And if you know what Smart View looked like on 2000 and 2003, this was the quote-unquote ribbon that I had created back then, which was a toolbar. So if you think back to that version that many years ago, the construct were toolbars that persisted. And you can move those around and customize and make different icons. But this is where it started from. You might have a hard time seeing that. So I zoomed in a little bit. And I had the functionality there at that time as a ribbon toolbar construct. So I was calling these clicks and a half because you'd click the drop down and then execute the routine that you needed to do. So I was calling those click and a halves. This is what we got once we were able to go to Office 2010. So we went from 2000, 2003, we skipped 7, we went to 10, and then we got Smart View as well installed and enabled, and this is what it looked like. So we were on version 11.113 at the time. We had Office 2010, and this was Smart View. And if anybody could tell me where member selection on here is, anybody? Yeah, hidden in one of those little green alien buttons. So depending on your resolution, whoever the developer was using the 71-inch screen in their home theater to build and develop, everything showed and appeared on their screen. So part of showing this slide is not only just to kind of tease about it, was when you're doing the development and you're customizing, you're creating your ribbon, kind of keep in mind that a lot of people, when they're working, don't work on enormous projector screen to do their work. They work on primarily laptops or small desktop monitors, those types of things. So keep that in mind as well. When you're putting it together, you're designing it, you're creating it, and you're doing some of the logistics of the buttons and arranging, people only have so much real estate on their screen to use. So if your resolution is set at different points, you are going to see these kind of what I call green alien buttons. In addition, when you're doing that, think of the logistics of the buttons. So in this version of Smart View, you notice that, originally it was the Hyperion ribbon. That's changed to say Smart View. But in this version, refresh and submit were right next to each other. And I can't tell you how many times myself, as an admin, would hit submit by accident. So you'll kind of see as, later on in the presentation, for the customizations that I've done, I've purposely logistically put submit on one side and refresh on the other on purpose, so that I don't mistakenly go and hit one because they're so close to each other. The other thing was the visibility. So we talked about member selection. It's in one of the dialog bubbles there. It's hidden. It's a really tiny icon. It's still today in the latest version a really tiny icon. And for me, member selection is something that I use all of the time. So it's wonderful that refresh is a nice big button. You have the ability to change the size of the buttons. And it's really not that difficult. Think about that as well as you're developing and designing. What buttons do users use more frequently that you'd like to have in a bigger size so that they can easily and readily see that when they're doing the ad hoc navigation and the things that they're interacting with any of your EPM applications? We'll talk about some of the options. We'll talk about menu items. So essentially any of the quote-unquote menu items that existed in the Hyperion, either toolbar or ribbon, exist as a VB function that you can call through the API. The other thing that I'll show and share with you is I've heard on a number of different sessions is I have a really hard time with substitution variables. So if you're an S-based or planning person, you have a limited set of places that you can go and either visualize those or change those or modify those. We'll show you a way that you can actually change those here from Smart View itself. You can add or create new ones, and you can also keep the formula to retrieve that as a formula as the variable changes over time. Okay? So I wanted to start off with this one more towards the front, frequently asked questions. So do you have to have Smart View installed? Yes. This does not replace Smart View. I love Smart View. I want to keep it there. I don't want to take it away. I'm trying to do things that bring out extra functionality, enhance some of the features, call out some of the things in the API calls that are accessible but not necessarily directly exposed. Does it break Smart View? No. It doesn't break Smart View, and why? So it doesn't break Smart View because it's using, leveraging, and accessing and calling the same Smart View library that you have to have as a part of the installation. So when you download and you run the Smart View EXE, which I wish they would change the name already, when you download and install that, it puts it in the Oracle Smart View bin, all that wonderful file folder structure. this ribbon is going to call and access that same Smart View. It's a .bas, it's a library file that Smart View is calling itself to execute those actions. The last one. I get this one all of the time. How many tickets have been submitted for your GE Smart View ribbon? Anyone want to take a guess? No GE people can answer? You're correct. None. There have been no tickets submitted for the GE ribbon that had an issue. It's Smart View itself. So that's a little bit of a safe, haven for me, that the things that I'm doing are leveraging what's currently existing in Smart View itself. So I'm not going to break it. If something is broken, it means something in Smart View itself is not working properly. Okay, so I wanted to make sure and go through those kind of right off the top. A lot of people ask, I'm trying to deploy this or roll this out. What does it break? I'm not going to be able to get support for it. So let's start off with going through the step-by-step procedures. How do you create your own ribbon? So I want you to be able to create your own. So there's not a lot of magic to this. You have a few things that you need. Smart View installed. So we already kind of talked about that. This is going to sit alongside of Smart View. You're going to want to be able to have the developer's guide. So typically either you can go out to the web and get the documentation, or you could download it and use it as a PDF. Typically I was downloading it as a PDF and printing it out and highlighting all the things that were new. I'm a little bit of a mad scientist if you can't tell. The other thing that you're going to need is called the Custom UI Editor for Microsoft. It's a free, very lightweight utility. Download that. That's going to be where you're going to construct the ribbon itself. And then the other thing that you're going to need to have is a little bit of knowledge about the XML, HTML tagging language. It's not very difficult, along with a little bit of VBA skills. So let's start to talk about some of these tools that you're going to need and what they are. So the thing that I talked about was the user interface. So what is the Microsoft Fluent user interface? Typically people call that the quote-unquote ribbon. So instead of calling it Mathui, we're going to call it the ribbon from now on. The ribbon, when they came out with it, going from 2000, 2003 to 7 and beyond, was this whole concept of designing the ribbon in areas, subject areas, groups that logically made sense to group together in a ribbon style format. So they took away all those toolbars and they made it this ribbon construct, and what works behind that is more of HTML or XML tagging language. When you take a look at it, you want to make sure that you're aware of some of the terms and the technology of how it's being constructed and how it's laid out. So you can think about things in a logical manner of things that are in groups, they're in tabs. Within those you have buttons, you have drop downs, you have checkboxes, all the different things that I think you're used to as a part of using the Office product itself now these days. Any questions yet? Okay. The other thing to keep in mind is when you're on a ribbon and you now are doing extra functionality, a good example, because I know a lot of people in finance use pivot tables. When you go to start to create a pivot table and you click on the table itself, it pulls up this other menu dialog. And what that's considered is called a contextual tab. And if you use Smart View now, you're familiar with, you have your Smart View tab or ribbon, and then when you connect to Essbase, you have the Essbase ribbon. When you connect to HFM, so on and so forth. Those are considered contextual ribbons because it's now interacting with that grid, recognizing you have that type of provider on your grid, and pulling up that contextual component. A part of the interface is making sure that you have to start off creating your ribbon a Microsoft macro-enabled workbook. So create your workbook, give it the name that you want. That's going to be the file that you modify and customize as a part of the development. You could start from scratch, meaning you could start from a blank workbook, there's nothing wrong with that, and create it from step one, meaning if you go in, you actually have the ability to insert kind of a default template as a part of the UI editor. If you go in there and you click on the sample, it'll say insert, and it wants you to insert the XML, Excel, custom template. You're going to want to do that, but you're also going to want to make sure that you do it as a part of 2010 custom UI. So I know there are slight differences between 2010 and 2007. You're going to want to do 2010 and then follow the screenshots and documentation that I have in the presentation. So if you do it as a part of 2010, 2007 should automatically work as a part of that UI interface. So this is what happens when you open up the default UI editor as the template. As we've been talking so far, you're going to want to keep in mind the different tagging is a part of the language in here. So you notice that it starts off with an open tag and then the hash and the close tag. So if you take a look, you have the ribbon at the top, open, and you have the ribbon at the bottom to close it out. Everything in between are what we talked about: tabs, buttons, drop downs, checkboxes, as you navigate through that list. You can see that when I was mentioning before, this is the statement that you're going to need in order to get it to work for 2010 and above. I'm not exactly certain why they picked Office 2009 / that's the naming convention, and that's what works in order to get the custom UI XML enabled. Ribbon, tabs, tab ID, a group, a button, and closing the group. So trying to highlight and show you, stepping it through, where you're opening, where you're closing, what the different elements are as you're navigating through the ribbon itself. Ribbon images. So you have the ability to create custom images or use the images that are part of the Microsoft Office library. I would caution you, Microsoft has the ability to update, change, modify, delete any of those custom images that they give you out of the box. So you could have a happy smiley face and all of a sudden it turns into the frowny devil face. They have the ability to change it. It's Microsoft. I don't think they would do that, but throwing that caveat out there for you. Caution to the wind. The other thing you have the ability to do, which I was mentioning, is create your own custom image. The construct or naming convention is just slightly different. In the one from Microsoft, it's image MSO, Microsoft Office. You identify that with an MSO ID. There are a few different places out there if you Google to find out what those MSO IDs are. If you just want to use Microsoft's library, you're more than free to do that. If you do decide to create your own custom image, the suggestion is to use either 32 or 62 pixel images. So they're relatively small, which is probably why Oracle decided to make most of their buttons that size, because that's typically the construct of 32 by 32 or 64 by 64. I would suggest to do 64 because if you decide to blow up the image to a larger or versus a smaller image, you might get a better picture quality because of that. So how do you do that? Either pick the image that you want to use, or if you create your own custom image, you're going to want to insert that into your UI editor. Two ways to be able to do that. Either right-click on the custom UI 14 XML, and it'll give you a dialog that says, do you want to insert an image? Yes, you pick your image and it inserts. Or you could just insert it from the top menu and insert icons. Okay. Something else that I learned as a part of doing this, also being kind of a little bit more of an Excel freak, is Excel files are zip files. So if you thought back to the XLS days compared to the XLSX, and why you had the same file but you had the two different formats, when you saved it, they're completely different sizes, is because in the new format, those are actually now, you can actually change it to .zip, and you could see all of the packaged components that are in that zip file. So essentially when you're building this ribbon, you're actually adding those images to that compressed zip file within that Excel file itself. So now let's actually start from the custom template and start customizing and creating our own ribbon. And keep in mind we're going to do the ribbon, the tabs, the groups, the labels, the buttons, the images. A part of doing that now, we're going to want to make sure that all of our IDs are unique. If your ID potentially has a name that is exactly the same as one that is on the Microsoft ribbon, is on the Smart View ribbon, is on any of those other ribbons, you may run into issues that your code, your button, something may not work because it's trying to understand and interpret why is that button there because the one already exists. So ensure that you have all of your IDs are being set and they're unique. You can see in here that I've now started to customize the ribbon, giving it a tab ID name. The way that you do that is assigning it a label. The label here is your own ribbon, Kscope 16. And now you're going to tell it where you want it to present when it enables as an add-in. So in this example, I have it being added after add-ins. So typically add-ins is the last tab on those ribbons that you have enabled. I want it to open always at the end. So I'm going to say open after add-ins. In the example that I'm going to show you, I've added it after the home tab. And funny enough, it's not just home, it's actually tab home. So there are a few things that are not necessarily first and foremost intuitive as you're building out. So keep that in mind as well while you're doing that. You can now kind of scroll down a little bit. I've added a clipboard, a grouping font, just default from Microsoft. So when you go into home and you want to doing your formatting, those will now appear as part of the grouping section. So I have two groups in there. I've now created another group, a custom Kscope group. I've labeled it my ribbon Kscope 16. So now everything is still unique. The button ID. So now this button ID is for the button itself. You're going to label it. So I've labeled it here in this example, the MDX guy. The next thing that you see there is where you're going to change the sizing of your button or your icon. In this example, I made it large. If you left it alone and you didn't have that, it would be the small, quote-unquote, normal size button. The action. So the action is now where you're linking and hooking and connecting this UI editor and the XML tagging to your add-in. So this is where it's going to call your subroutine or your module within your add-in itself. So on action, it's going to execute the MDX guy subroutine. And the image in this case is image. It's not image MSO. And in this one, I've created my own custom image called GEGC. I have another button on there as well, which is for options. I've also created that one as large, and I've ended the group for that. Other things to keep in mind when you're developing. So as you're going through and you're developing something to help you and also help users as a part of the customization, give them clues of what it is. So they don't have to call you and ask you and email you and things are always broken. So some of the things that you have the ability to do, so if you think about in this example, when you hover over the B for bold, what you're seeing there in that white box is bold, Control B, so it's giving you the shortcut there. So that's the header of it. And then make your text bold is the description or the text to what that button is doing. You have the ability to do that as part of your customization as well, and that's called a screen tip and a super tip. So the screen tip here is that header or that where it says bold, Control B. In this case, it's Gary Christie's MDX Minions. So that's the screen tip. The super tip is what comes underneath. So in this case, I'll let you read it on your own time, but essentially he is our MDX guru at GE, and I think globally. So those are those, sub-tip, screen tip, and super tip. More a part of the customization. So as we're now going through, you should start to see some of that customization come to life. Keep in mind, if you have the Excel file open, you may get an error or warning saying you cannot save the custom UI XML editor because the file's already open. It would want you to shut it down so you could save that XML tagging file. But you should start to see now as we were going through, you've renamed the ribbon. In the example that I had there, I was going to go after add-ins, but this one I wanted to show you it's slightly different, and I'm adding it here after home. And in this example, like I mentioned, it's after tab home. You've now created new buttons, you've added image icons, and those were now embedded within the Excel file itself. There is still one thing missing though, which are those VBI calls, the VBA API calls that you now need to input and insert into your Excel macro-enabled file. You may all be familiar with how to do that, a part of your daily life. Potentially, users show you all the different fun macros and modules that they create. You're going to want to go into the Excel developer tab. That's not typically default enabled, so you may have to go in and enable that tab in Excel itself. Once it's enabled, you go into the developer tab, you open up the Visual Basic module screen to be able to input, insert, and start to now code your VBA. And you simply just insert your modules. The things here that I want to make sure to clarify is that typical best practice is when you're doing this and you want to leverage the Smart View API to insert the smartview.bas file, which is that library, the Smart View library, and have that a part of your enabled macro file. Typically, you're going to want to do that so that you don't have to have your VB calls try to navigate to some other file folder somewhere else in the directory. You're going to want to call it right a part of that enabled macro file. And then the other thing you're going to want to do is now start adding and building your VB modules to code what you want against Smart View VB API. So now let's get into customizing the ribbon and adding in a module. So being able to create the ribbon itself, you're going to go in and use the XML. Now we're going to actually go into the VBA module and start to create the subroutines. So in this example, what we're attaching the MDX guide to is the refresh menu, or the refresh. So you have the ability to now hook that up to your button, to the refresh functionality of Smart View. This is the subroutine and the call. In the VBA developer guide that comes with Smart View, or you go out and download, they do have snippets and examples of some of the codes. And they also have a kind of definition and description of what that menu, that item, that option should be doing. Again, test it, retest it, make sure that that is correct. You may run into instances where they've released Smart View but haven't kept the documentation all the way up to date. Things do tend to change over time, so it's good to test and retest to make sure that what you're wanting and intending for the user and then that action actually does what you want. Options. So as a part of using Smart View, you know there are oodles and oodles of options that are out there. You can suppress data, you can navigate, you can do all kinds of wonderful things. Another option here that I'm giving an example of is being able to change the options for display. So this is for a sheet option for no data or missing. The thing here to keep in mind is when you're creating these modules as a part of the VBA, if you notice here, I'm doing the subroutine set option. In the brackets there, you're going to notice that it says control as I control. That's going to actually know that that's going to be an icon button that's on your ribbon that it's going to want to go back over to that XML that you were editing and call that and link those two together. So when you did the action in your XML, this is the name that you're going to want to give it, set option. That's what's referred to back in your XML. Nigel, I'll answer you this way. For the most part, yes. Every once in a while, I've found an instance where we were on 1.1.3, we went to 1.2.1, we went to 1.2.2, we went to different versions of Smart View as they kept going along, and all of a sudden, one of my coworkers goes, "It's broken." What do you mean it's broken? Well, I tried to do zoom in, and it didn't work. Well, what did it do? I tried to do zoom next, and it gave me zoom bottom. Example, I'm not saying that that was But that's an example where on here, if zoom bottom was 0 and zoom next was 1, they may have flipped those potentially. So just keep those kinds of things in mind as you're going through. Read the documentation, test it out. If that's what it does, peace, move on. These are all the lists of the options. If you take a look in the developer guide, it's actually laid out as a table structure of sorts. So if you look at HSV underscore zoom in, that's actually equal to 1. So that you have the ability here when you say null, comma 6, true, that's actually for suppressed rows. And if you count it down, that's actually item number 6 on that list. So you could use either or. I typically like to use the numbers because then I don't run into spelling mistakes. I can't typically spell the number 6 wrong. So I typically take that table, I format it with the numbers, and now I don't have a chance of spelling the word suppress wrong. Another example of an option, which is member name and description. So now for those of you who are aware, you do have the ability for S-based connections in Smart View to now see the member names and descriptions. Yay. This is the subroutine and the options for doing that VBA call. If you were to go back, it should be option 16 in that list as you navigate down. They're pretty straightforward. Yet another example of an option. Pound numeric 0. I can't tell you how many times people just, a part of using Smart View, asked, well, I put 0 in my planning form, and then I hit submit, and my number of $100 came back. So what I did is I put in 0.000001, I hit submit, and it worked. I don't necessarily want that, though, as part of my database. It's okay, these days, but typically you don't want that behavior happening. And the way that you want to be able to drive better behavior so that people actually see the 0 or submit a true 0 as a value is using this pound numeric 0. That's the language that you need in order to enable that submit 0 checkbox in Smart View in your options. And this is a way to be able to do it. Any of my GE coworkers like these 3? Use Excel formatting is the last of the 3. So a lot of times I get, well, I formatted my sheet and I did my retrieve and now I get it with commas and bold and all that other fun stuff. But when I navigate and do the other things that I want, all that goes away. And the option to be able to do that is to use Excel formatting. So you can keep all of the highlighting, the bold, and the underline, and the commas a part of the grid that keeps being refreshed. This is the option to be able to turn that on or turn that off. And you can see here I did make it very explicitly clear to myself as I was doing it. Yes, it's turned on. No, it's not. And then just literally calling the true or false a part of that call itself in the subroutine. Yes, you should be able to use either one. Unless they change the ordering of it. So typically a part of changing that option, they don't just change the numbering, they actually move that option to a different number in that list. It's possible. Again, I'll just go back to test it, retest it. So. Sure. I get that. So now let's actually take a look at some of the customization that we've been doing to this point. Okay. So you can see I'm in Excel, and and I have Excel open, and I have my macro-enabled workbook open. And you can see where it has put my new ribbon. Just after the Home tab, your own ribbon, Kscope 16. And now if we take a look, we've created the groups for the kind of default Microsoft groups of your clipboard group, your font group. Those look exactly the same as the ones here. So a part of doing your customization, if you also want to include just kind of default Microsoft buttons, functionality, put that right on your ribbon because you know that your users use bold and underline and paste special and all that. Include that on your ribbon if you so desire. So all of these are available as groups, as buttons that you could call and put on your own custom ribbon itself. As we navigate down, you can see now that we have the clipboard group, the font group, and now I have my Kscope 16 custom group that I started to develop and create. Here you can see the MDX guy. And when I hover over it, you can see the tips that I have there. For the bold is the header tip. Gary Chris is the MDX minions. And you can see the text or the detail for that to explain why he is a guru in MDX. Okay. The other button that I created was the set options. And you notice in both of these examples, I've made the buttons really nice and big so that people could see them in this instance. And then I've created a few other buttons as well. So you can start to see this develop and build out as you're building out the XML. You're building out the modules and the subroutines in the Excel-enabled, macro-enabled workbook. And as it starts to grow and gain a life of its own. So I'm going to stop there for a moment. Are there any questions yet so far? Yes. It shouldn't impact this because this is its own independent ribbon. So if Smart View crashes and goes away, this will just stay there because it just enables itself as its own independent add-in. I didn't catch the first part, I'm sorry. Yes, yes. So in that instance, correct. If Smart View does crash and it now becomes disabled, if you did try to click or press any of the buttons on your custom ribbon that you've created, you would get that error because what it's trying to do is call that Smart View ribbon that got enabled and the library attached to it. It's nice to know, but typically, yeah, thank you. The comment was about essentially clearing out all disabled add-ins, and there's a registry key to be able to do that. So. I'm glad that you asked that. So let's actually take a look at kind of the final version of what I had created as a utility for users at GE. And actually the one that I have here is a slightly different version that I created on my own time that I'm calling Smart View++. And the way that you do that here, so this is a fully developed ribbon. The way that I'm having them do that is through Connect. And it pulls up the Smart View connection panel just like you would see in Smart View. So I've tried to encapsulate and incorporate all of the different buttons, items, functions, menus that made sense all in one place. So the other thing to keep in mind is that contextual ribbon changing, that's an option within Smart View so that if you go from an S-based connection and you're on Smart View, it'll flip back and forth between the tabs over here. So it'll flip between Smart View and the other tab that you have. I typically like to turn that off so that it just stays here. I don't need to flip back and forth between the different tabs. And now you can actually see here, the resolution, I'm having a conflict in the resolution even here between what I'm seeing on my laptop versus what's being presented on screen. I have one of those alien buttons. So I didn't even do a good job being able to incorporate additional resolution issues. And you can see here, as a part of this example, I have a number of different options that you can enable as checkboxes. It's a little bit more advanced functionality for creating the ribbon, but I have those on there as well that you can literally check the box to suppress missing, suppress zero, navigate without data. So let's go ahead and connect, because I think there are a few other things a part of this that are, and all of you at GE, just close your eyes. It'll all go away soon. So let's go navigate to our favorite application database of Sample Basic. Let's connect. So you can actually see that I put in my ID and my password. I'm not trying to do anything funny here. It actually refreshes and retrieves the grid. So you should be familiar with this grid typically. If you're an S-based planning person, you typically see this or have seen this before. And Smart View works just the same to navigate, to zoom, to drill, to double click, all that fun stuff. You have all the buttons here logically organized in my mind. You're free to organize and create it however you feel. Refreshing all, undoing, redoing, zooming out. So when I was first using it, zoom in had 3 options. Now it has a lot more. So that's why I had incorporated, similar to Smart View, eventually catching up to what I had, which is actually kind of interesting. They actually had all those extra zoom in VBA calls, and I was able to incorporate it as a dropdown. So when I first did this, it had literally the next bottom all. They started as Smart View was developing different versions over time to include the extra ones. I typically use those top 3 anyway. But those are available in the VB call even before they made it to the Smart View ribbon itself. Another one to call out is insert attributes. Do any of you find that useful? To be able to just insert attributes without guessing, calling your admin, typing it in. It's literally a button that you press once and all the attributes come in. In the latest version of Smart View, they've actually enhanced that feature so that you can pick and choose not only the attributes you want, but the members in those attributes that you want to display and be inserted. Pivoting, I'm not sure if you're aware, but you have the ability to do 2 different types of pivots. Either pivot, which goes from column or row to column, or pivot to POV. So it'll literally take the row member in event that there's more than one and pivot it to the POV. Member selection. So this was my friend that I talked about earlier. I made it a really nice, big, large button in the middle of my ribbon. My users are using that all of the time, and I want to make sure that they know, first and foremost, where that is, so they don't have to search, hunt, peck, and find it under the My Friend Alien button. Ancestor position. So for all of you HFM folks, this is not a S-based or planning option that's available, but it's available for HFM connections. You can change where your ancestors show up on your grid, either above or below. So I give you that option as well. So this is not just for S-based or planning. You can use this for any of the different provider connections, assuming that that functionality is available for that provider. Likewise, for member display, now you have the ability to have more than just the name only or description only. You now, for S-based and planning, can see member names and descriptions. So I give you those options. That changes the option here. You don't have to go back into that options dialog GUI menu with all the different tabs and buttons and options and click boxes and click OK. It does it here in one click. Well, technically a click and a half again. POV, so you can flip the POV on and off, similar to how you can do in Smart View. I included a number of different Smart View Hyperion, what I was calling Hyperion menu items, because in Smart View versions prior, there was actually the add-in that came with a list of menu items, or you right-clicked and there was a Smart View and it gave you the menu. Some of those were not directly visible on the ribbon itself. You had to actually go either to that menu in the add-ins or to your right-click drop-down menu. It wasn't actually in the ribbon. So I tried to include some of those, and I know they've been getting better at including those in Smart View as time has gone on. So I have a whole list of different ones that I put in there. So I give you a, still call it a click and a half. So you can set pound numeric 0 without having to go back in, type it in, you misspelled it, oops. This will set it for you exactly with that construct. Pet peeve of mine is adjusting the column lists when you retrieve. So I've created a button for that so that I could just lock in. I don't want the columns to expand every time I refresh. I just want them the way that I had them. And a whole bunch of other ones here that I put in here. Query Designer was one that I used quite frequently. Drilling, so if you have drill through reports that are created, you have the ability to launch those from the menu itself. We talked about the options. Submit, you can see here, I accidentally clicked it. It's way on the other side of refresh. They're nowhere near each other. This one is the one that I was mentioning before as well. So you have really two abilities here for variables, which is getting the variable or setting the variable. So assuming you have the right privileges to set substitution variables and values, this will work for you via a dialog box. So literally, if you want to get the value, you put in the application name and the database, and it should pull back variables and values, assuming that there are ones set on that. And literally, I'm going to select it from the list. So you could have 3, you could have 10, you could have 20. And when I insert it, it's actually going to insert it as a formula. It's going to insert it on the grid. And now this is probably a bad placement for it. We could try it. And when I refresh, the formula stays. So if you think of it from the construct of users creating reports, and they're doing reports that are the time periods across the columns, and they use the substitution variable and they use it as a formula, the moment the administrator or whoever's updating those values updates, they literally need to copy, save as, create a new version of that workbook for the next period or month, and hit refresh, and it refreshes accordingly. So essentially, you're creating more hands-free report maintenance for them. Similar on the set substitution variable, slightly similar dialog box. You're going to give it the application name, the database, the variable name, and the value. And you can update it from here. Or you can create a brand new one from here. You'd fill in all the information, you'd hit set subbar, dialog would pop up giving you that message that if you do have the right provisioning, it was set. The other thing I want to mention is that there's a long list of custom Excel formulas that are built into the ribbon itself. So how many of you have ever wanted to know, without going somewhere else outside your ad hoc, your retrieve, your report, whether a member was level 0 or not? You can do that from here. Level, generation, parent, children, member information, UDAs, attributes. If there's more than one of any of those, it pipe delimits it so that you know. So let's go ahead. Get level 1. And literally, if you could hear me, all I did was hit enter. I didn't go up to refresh. My report is just the way that I had it before. I did nothing aside from finding out what was the level number of that member. If you think about some of the other functions that are in there as far as getting a parent, you could now use that to build a pseudo hierarchy right alongside to figure out where does that cost center roll up to? Where does that account roll up to amongst the hierarchy? equals get parent equals get parent. So let's do one thing here. Let's delete that. So the function is actually a part of the member outline information that I'm calling a part of that Excel formula. So I've actually created a custom Excel formula that references the VB API. So part of typing in the equals get level, it'll use that a part of going out, calling the right member information that I want, and pulling that back as a value. But you still have the formula. So you don't have that ampersand subbar, refresh, and now you get the value back, but what was the subbar? I forgot. So that's actually a great question. So time check. 4 minutes. Wow. Okay, so to answer your question, I do have examples of that are on my blog. So great question. I think a part of that, let's flip back to the slide. So there are a number of different things that are also embedded within the ribbon itself. Any of those examples, if you have a question, you want to see something else, I will gladly post it on my blog so that you can see what that looks like. Yes? Sure. Sure, absolutely. I mean, you could build that a part of your subroutine. Yep, absolutely. So one thing that I'd say is fill out your evaluations. And the other thing here, as a part of doing the presentation, that is my active live G email. Send me an email if you have any questions. I will answer every one of you. I've answered people in the past that have come up and asked me. Someone else's presentation was actually a brainchild of something I had done before, and he thanked me for that. Follow me on Twitter. Go to my blog. I post lots of wonderful things out there. You may find some of the things that you saw in today's presentation there as well.